Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Samantha Levy, and I am New York Policy Manager for American Farmland Trust and Farm to Institution, New York State. And I will be presenting today alongside Mikaela Ruiz-Ramón, AFT's New York Policy Consultant and my co-researcher and co-author on this report. We will present findings from our summer 2020 farm to school research detailed in our new report, Growing Resilience, Unlocking the Potential of Farm to School to Strengthen the Economy, Support New York Farms, and Improve Student Health in the Face of New Challenges. This report was released last week, so if you haven't had a chance to read the report yet, it can be found at farmland.org/growing resilience right there on your screen. Before we dive in, I wanted to say thank you to those that made this report possible, in particular the New York State Health Foundation, the Joyce and Irving Goldman Family Foundation, and members of American Farmland Trust. It's thanks to your generosity that this work was possible. I also want to recognize the school staff who have been working every day to serve New York food to kids in 2020 in spite of extraordinary challenges. And to thank those that created and support the state programs that support them. Governor Cuomo, the State Department of Agriculture, the State Department of Education, and the state legislature. On that, let's begin by hearing briefly from 3 New York farm to school champions who have been working to make sure these programs remain strong. First, it's a pleasure to introduce the Department of Agriculture and Markets Commissioner Richard Ball, a man who has shown incredible passion for and dedication to farm to school, both as a farmer and as Commissioner of Agriculture. And as a result, and thanks to Governor Cuomo, New York has one of the most comprehensive farm to school programs in the nation, helps schools support our farmers and serve healthy local food to our kids. Welcome, Commissioner, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Samantha. Really appreciate the good homework here. I want to thank you and the American Farmland Trust for putting this webinar together for us. And most importantly, thanks for your partnership on Farm to School. It's been a huge help, and you do great homework there. Also great to see my friends, Senator Metzger and Assemblywoman Lupardo. It's been a while. It's good to see your faces anyway. Thank you for that. This year has been unprecedented. It's been full of all kinds of challenge. We've seen so many vulnerabilities exposed across our society and certainly in our farm to school program and our food supply chain. So I'm thinking that farm to school is more important today though than it has ever been. As you know, it's always been a priority of mine, and I know the Senator and the Assemblywoman as well. And I think for many of us, we've been talking about farm to school for a very long time, but for today, you know, the program in New York really got going in 2015, helping to educate young people about agriculture, helping them to get good food, and at the same time, providing a boost to our farm economy. I would say that the accomplishments have been really amazing. To see this really take root, it's been great. You know, I'm thinking about New York Thursdays. I'm thinking about the farm to school grants, helping schools get equipment to better handle local food, better prepare it, hiring farm to school coordinators. It's been fantastic to be a part of this and see this growth. With our schools getting closed this spring, our partners at Farm to School suddenly showed themselves to be more than just school food people, but community people. I like to call them food responders because they stepped up when it was above and beyond the call of duty and still became the center of the community and helped feed not just our students, but our families as well. Now schools are starting to open up a little bit. The program is still working. It's still getting food to our students. We're still connecting the dots between our farm community and our students. We've seen Buffalo Public Schools, working with Cornell Cooperative Extension, launch a food truck that's getting out of the neighborhood, serving not just students, but also community members, educating people as we go. it's a pretty good example of how this thing can grow as we expand beyond just feeding students in school. So I've read through your report. I'm looking forward to listening to your comments about it. I'm looking forward to the important role that Farm to School will continue to play as we look to connect the dots between many of our vulnerable population and our students, in a way to connect them in a big way to, excuse me, our agricultural community. I'm excited about the resilience that we've seen from our farmers and from all of you, and certainly to our students in school. And I'm excited about where we can go from this as we build back better. So look forward to your comments, and look forward to the presentation very much. And thanks so much for the opportunity, Sam.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for all that you do. So next, it is my great pleasure to introduce Senator Jen Metzger, representing the 42nd Senate District and our current chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee in New York. The senator and her staff have been tireless champions for Farm to School these past 2 years, and we're so grateful for her leadership, her service, and her support. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And it's so great to see you, Commissioner Ball, my partner in the Assembly, Assemblywoman Lupardo, and you, Samantha, and Mikaela. I'm so excited to hear your presentations today. I mean, everyone here has just done such tremendous work on Farm to School. And your leadership has been so important in really, making New York a leader in this area. As Senate Agriculture Chair, it has been such an incredible honor and privilege to work with you all and your colleagues over these last 2 years to support Farm to School across New York State. As a parent who fought locally for Farm to School in my school district in the Rondout Valley, as a legislator, and as a representative of a district with some 2,000 farms, this has been one of my top priorities to see this program continue to take root and grow. I'm extremely grateful for your hard work to build awareness at local and state levels about the importance and the value of expanding Farm to School programs. For this kind of vital research and policy work you're doing, AFT is doing, to identify and effectively advocate for pathways to expanding these programs. And for your great work to directly with school districts to help them overcome obstacles to creating robust Farm to School programs. AFT's Farm to Institution New York State, or FINIS program, has been invaluable in helping to build local capacity by bringing together school food program directors and staff across the state to learn from one another, mentor one another, and train together. I was really fortunate to have the chance to see the program in action briefly last year at the Omega Institute. For more than a decade, a national Farm to School movement has been building as health professionals and policymakers confronted alarming rates of childhood obesity and a society inundated by highly processed food of low nutritional value. This at the same time that we're seeing a loss of family farms and farmland across the country and here in New York. Farm to School really puts the pieces together, bringing nutritious meals into the cafeteria and creating a culture of wellness for children, teaching kids about local farms and where their food comes from, and helping repair the fabric and build sustainability into our agricultural economy. I fully recognize it's not an easy road to hoe, as they say, really growing this program. There are challenges, of cultural and economic changes. School districts strapped for resources. It's been a real issue, I know, for many school districts that I represent. School kitchens without basic equipment to prep and cook meals. And now our enormous, economic and health challenges that we face during this global pandemic. And as the commissioner put it so well, our school staff have really played such a vital role as food responders. I think that is like that really sums it up well in this time of growing food insecurity. But this health crisis, on the, a positive side, I guess you could say, has really deepened people's appreciation for locally sourced fresh foods. It's also brought into sharp focus the grave health risks posed by obesity and other risk factors associated with poor diet. I'm a positive person by nature, and I believe that out of crisis comes new perspective and opportunities for change. New York State has an incredibly solid foundation on which to build its farm to school program. At this critical juncture with a new year and new challenges before us all, I'll certainly work with and urge the incoming agriculture chair and my colleagues to provide continued support to our farm to school programs, to expand the program, to facilitate its wider use, and to provide the policies and infrastructure that state government can bring to ensure its success. I want to thank you, American AFT, again, for all the great work that you are doing and continue to do in so many different realms, including this really important realm of farm to school. And I look forward to hearing the presentations today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator, and extraordinarily well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. So finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Assemblywoman Donna Lupardo, who represents the 123rd Assembly District and chairs the Assembly Agriculture Committee. Donna has shown exemplary leadership in the Assembly, building support for programs that assist our farmers in New York State. Donna, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Got to unmute myself. All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Okay, perfect, all right. Well, I get a real kick out of seeing that photograph because the three of us have really developed a very good friendship and a deep commitment to all things agriculture, certainly to the Farm to School program, which is so highly valued by us and by people across the state. I think my two colleagues have pretty much summed this up in exactly the way that I would have put it. There's really nothing to dislike about this program. It is a winning scenario all the way around. We want to promote child nutrition. We want to promote child health. At the same time, we want to support our farmers. We want to support an agricultural and food economy that's local and robust. We want to respect our farmers, and we want to prove the point that there is a major return on investment when we make the types of investments in our farms in general, but by making these connections, it's just a positive thing all the way around. Certainly this COVID pandemic that we are facing, as horrible and as challenging it has been, as Senator Metzger mentioned, has proven to provide just enormous opportunities for us to reimagine things and to reemphasize the importance of programs like Farm to School. I mean, the intersection of public health and food supply chain issues is enormous, and we're going to be talking about this for a very long time to come. I'm going to be making it a central part of my budget discussions. We held a budget hearing recently. It was the first time that the committees on economic development, small business, agriculture, and the task force on food and nutrition came together on one topic: food supply, farming issues, and all of the things that we can do in our budget that can support that. It's a unique opportunity for us to really look at how to make the state budget work for all of our interests. And I'm very pleased with your report. I sincerely appreciate the specific recommendations that you make on budget, of course, continuing to support what you're doing, to have people actually coordinating across the state to make this work, to overcome a lot of the bureaucratic challenges, to have clear guidelines so that we know what's involved with this reimbursement, but specifically to focus on those supply chain logistics, which really hold up progress in a lot of places. Now, we're all going to become experts in discussing logistics and understanding that it's key. It really is key to food hubs. It's key to aggregation. It's key to making sure we get the products into places that we need. So I'm going to go along with Senator Metzger on congratulating Commissioner Ball for using the word food responders. We're going to be talking about that phrase for a long time to come. And I would be remiss to not sincerely thank my Senate colleague, Senator Metzger, for her dedication, work, and really outstanding efforts, not only on behalf of her district, but across the state. And we sincerely hope that she will consider returning to public service, maybe in the Senate soon. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Assemblywoman and Senator and Commissioner. A perfect frame for our conversation today. I also want to recognize the other senators and assembly members who have joined us and thank them so much for their time, for their dedication, and to the staff that are joining us as well. Really appreciate all that you do and your attention and focus on this. So time to dive in almost. At the end of this webinar, there will be some time for Q&A. So throughout, folks who are joining us, when you have questions, please write them into the question box. And even if we don't get to them today, we will email everybody with answers to any of the questions that are asked. So don't hesitate to ask any question that you might have, large or small. Before we move on, however, we're going to launch a poll to learn who's joining us today. So if folks would like to please just take a moment and click one of the responses there. I'll give you a minute to do that. Excellent. So it looks like we've got many folks from schools. We've got folks who work directly with farms or schools. We've got advocates and researchers. And then about a third of folks who are joining us are legislators or government employees. So that's great. And 8% are farmers, vendors, or food trade association. Really, really appreciate you taking. Oh, I can share the poll results. We are sharing the poll results. Okay, great. Technical side is not my forte. Thank you all for taking a moment to do that. So now that we know who you are, now we can hide those results. Now that we know who you are, let me share a little bit quickly about who we are. So AFT is a national nonprofit conservation organization with a mission to save the land that sustains us. We do that in 3 ways. And what could be more important to thriving farms than steady, reliable, lucrative markets to sell into? And that is really the reason for our work at Farm to Institution New York State, or FINEST, and why we launched this collaborative initiative in 2013. FINEST is a collaborative initiative working to strengthen the economic security of farmers and the health of New Yorkers by empowering institutions like schools, hospitals, universities, and corrections facilities to spend at least a quarter of their food budget on food grown in New York State, supporting our farmers while improving the diet of those that they serve. And as I said before, Senator Metzger, Assemblywoman Lupardo, Commissioner really dug in on this topic, why farm to school matters now. And in 2020, we at AFT believe that farm to school is more relevant than ever. This summer, New York Farm Bureau found that 2/3 of farmers reported loss of sales and market reductions due to COVID-19. And institutional purchases create new markets for our farmers while keeping money in the community. This also helps to build local supply chains that are more resilient to disruption than the global food supply chains that left us with empty shelves earlier this year. Second, this pandemic emphasized disparities in health outcomes amongst white, Black, and Hispanic New Yorkers, with those with diet-related diseases at higher risk for severe outcomes from COVID-19. This highlights even more how increasing access to healthy, fresh food and improving diet is a necessary public health intervention. And to drive these points home further, I'll briefly share some statistics. National research shows that each dollar invested in farm to school generates up to an additional $2.16 in local economic activity, And each farm to school job has been shown to create 2 or more jobs in the community. More specific to New York, a 2016 Cornell study found that if schools were to purchase just 1 additional fruit or vegetable item per week to serve in their cafeteria from New York farms, it would generate over $9 million in revenue for New York vegetable farmers, or over $2 million for New York fruit growers. The economic opportunities here could be immense. And looking more closely at our kids, according to the Department of Health, 1 in 3 New York kids and teens are overweight or obese, belying the importance of improving student diets and teaching healthy habits at school to support better health outcomes now and in the future. At the same time, child food insecurity rates have grown, particularly this year, with new Feeding America estimates from fall of 2020 showing that 1 in 4 kids in New York are food insecure. Now, as half of a child's daily calories come from school, from our food responders, farm to school is an important opportunity to improve the diet and access to healthy food for over 1.7 million kids across the state, a true win-win. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to Mikaela to begin to share our findings.
Great. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here with you today. So as some of you may know, in January of this year, we released our first report, which was Growing Opportunity. And then in the process of doing that, it, as most research does, raised a lot of questions that required follow-ups, which is what we ended up doing this summer. We set out to gather more information about what kinds of local purchases schools are making in New York, and importantly, what barriers they continue to run into after the conclusion of year 2 of the New York 30% initiative. So we received a list from the New York State Department of Education of all the registered school food authorities in New York, which I will define for you in just a moment. And from this list, we generated a random sample of 300 K-12 school food authorities across the state that captured variation in school size and geography. So we fielded the survey during July of 2020, and we received a 54% response rate. And after checking the comparability of our sample, we are pretty confident that these findings are generalizable statewide to a reasonable degree. If you want more information about kind of the back details of our research, you can access the methods section and our survey tool online at farmland.org. You could advance the slide. So, School Food Authority, what is it? It is essentially the governing body that is responsible for the administration of meal programs at schools. A school food authority can be just one school, or it can be several schools aggregated in a school district. So it kind of varies. New York Food Product is another really important term to know as we go through this presentation. It is defined as items that are grown, harvested, or produced in New York State. And that includes processed products that are comprised of 50.1% or more raw agricultural materials by weight or volume. And then finally, one of the main points of this presentation is to discuss the New York State Farm to School Incentive, also known as the 30% Initiative. And under this program, school food authorities that spend at least 30% of their total lunch costs purchasing and serving New York grown food are eligible to receive an increased reimbursement from the state of up to 19 cents. And as we go through this presentation, please keep in mind that if we say school or schools, we actually mean school food authorities, and likewise local products or New York grown food, we mean New York food products. Both of these terms can just be a bit of a mouthful at times. So on to the findings. Start with some very exciting news. Most schools are buying local food. We found in our research that 86% of schools reported either intentionally or incidentally buying New York grown food. Intentional purchases mean schools are making a concerted effort to buy these kinds of products, and incidental purchases meaning schools made these types of purchases when they were able to, and it worked out for them. I want to point out that you can see that over half of schools, 64%, reported that they are intentionally buying local products from New York farms. So we asked schools to identify from a very long list of products which ones they increased their purchasing of by value during the 2019-2020 school year compared to previous years. We saw increases across the board in all of these categories compared to last year's survey data when we asked this same question, with notable increases in the purchases of fresh fruits and vegetables. Last year, 65% of schools reported buying more New York grown fruit. This year, it was 87%. Last year, 45% of schools reported buying more vegetables, and this year it increased to 54%. We see that about half of schools reported buying more New York produced fluid milk. And we also saw a substantial increase in the number of schools that are buying processed products. Last year, it was 3%. This year, it is 42%. That is a 1,300% increase, which is substantial. So in order to qualify, as I said, processed products must have 50.1% or more raw agricultural ingredients from New York. Examples of some of these processed products include grape juice, applesauce, granola, cheese sticks, and products like that. We're really excited about this finding because this represents serious new market growth for farmers and a positive indication that this program is spurring economic development in the food economy. Some of the products are coming from new companies that have been founded in New York, while others are coming from large corporations that have begun developing New York product lines. So here you can see the top 10 individual products that schools identified in our survey. You can see definitely New York is an apple state. We have in the #1 slot purchases of whole apples. We also see apple slices as the third most popular item. Again, about half of schools are purchasing fluid milk. And we see between 15 and 27% of schools are purchasing items such as yogurt, New York grape juice, tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, cucumbers, and cheese. So a lot of fresh items are heading to New York students.
Thank you, Mikaela. So newly this year, we were also able to run statistical analyses to determine whether there was a relationship between a school's size, its geographic location, or student demographic data, and whether they reported buying New York grown food. First, I'll report that we found that upstate schools, which we defined in this report as all counties above Ulster, Dutchess, and Sullivan, reported buying, were more likely to report buying New York grown food than downstate schools. The p-value there was 0.002 for you statistical folks out there, showing a clear relationship. And there was also a trend with a p-value of 0.088 of non-urban schools being more likely to report buying New York grown food than urban schools. And for those who don't have a background in stats, I'll just quickly say that a trend basically means a p-value of between 0.05 and 0.1, and that there was a relationship there. And with more data, we would likely see the p-value go down and show us that there is a clear statistical relationship between those two factors. Now, this, of course, has implications for who has access to New York grown food, as upstate and non-urban schools have disproportionately higher percentages of white students, and downstate and urban schools have disproportionately higher percentages of Black and Hispanic students. And these were the three demographics that we really looked at because we had really good data for them. Those were clear relationships, as you can see from those p-values geographically. However, we did collect data from the 5 largest public school districts in New York State: New York City, Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. And with the exception of Albany, all reported intentionally buying New York grown food and serving it to their students. And since those schools, those public school districts, serve on average 80 to 85% of the students in those urban areas, this means that most of the kids in our largest cities in New York are still getting access to New York grown food at school, but more research is needed to better understand the needs of urban districts across the state, and in order to ensure all students have access to New York grown food at school. Great, Mikaela, back to you.
Yeah. You could arrow, get the words up there. Perfect. So most schools still expect local purchasing to increase or stay the same, which is pretty great news, all things considered, what's happened this year. So compared to last year, these estimates of future purchases of New York grown food are a little bit more conservative. As you can see, last year it was about 3/4 of schools thought they would increase, and this year it's about half. But still, schools have a positive outlook, and the decreases can probably be attributed to a global pandemic. Next slide, please. So we did ask schools if they had any concerns about their ability to buy New York grown food or reach 30% in the future due to COVID-19. So here you can see that 72% of schools said yes or they were unsure. Keep in mind that the survey was conducted in July. So people were still kind of figuring things out at that point. The concerns that people reported were that changes in meal service would likely be incompatible or already were proving to be incompatible with serving New York grown food, in part because New York grown food sometimes requires a little bit more processing by staff. And there was a lack of staff, time, or capacity to coordinate local purchases. And then also there was concern that budget shortfalls or uncertainty, again stemming from pandemic and the impacts on school meal participation, would mean a lot less flexibility to spend on local products. And above all, just food service directors were juggling so many plates this summer, and they expressed that they were just trying to keep their heads above water and manage the many challenges that the pandemic was throwing their way. So in year one of the New York 30% initiative, 49 schools applied and 7 were ultimately successful after review. Those schools last year spent just under $3 million on New York food products and were serving 35,000 children daily. In year 2, we saw a lot of growth, which is very exciting. 57 schools applied, and amongst them, they spent over $5 million and served about 90,000 kids daily. So these are in the pre-application review phase, so these are not finalized yet, but State Ed said that schools were much better prepared this year for passing their review, and we have a lot of reason to be optimistic. What we've seen so far, excuse me, from the data that is coming in is that schools are not stopping at 30%. Among those 57 schools, the average reported spending level was 39% of their total lunch costs. And with one school district, very notable, was reporting over 63% of their lunch costs going towards purchases of local food. Also, all 7 schools that qualified last year re-qualified this year, and 6 out of those 7 schools increased their spending on local food products. So this is really great news. We're very excited about this. And also, we want to point out that 69% of schools that we surveyed reported actively working on increasing their spending of New York grown food and had plans to reach 30% in the next couple years. So we did wonder, however, about the impact of the pandemic on which schools are applying. So we asked that 44%, that big yellow chunk of the pie chart. We asked those schools that said they were working towards 30%, but were not yet ready to apply this year, after the 2019-2020 school year, about the impacts of the pandemic on their plans. And they reported that the switch to summer meal programs or the outright cancellation of meals in March definitely impacted their ability to reach 30% as it changed their purchases. Just over 1/5 said that they really had no time to purchase New York grown food or plan menus using these ingredients and kind of put in that capacity there. And then finally, just over 9% reported that their new meal service was incompatible with serving New York grown food. So based on this and also some anecdotal data collected from talking with food service directors from schools across the state, we do definitely have some reason to believe that the number of schools applying this year possibly could have been higher than 57 if a bunch of schools hadn't been derailed in their purchasing efforts by the changes caused by the pandemic.
Thanks, Mikaela. So now I have the great pleasure of sharing some of our most exciting findings from the report. In spite of all of these challenges, in spite of everything our food service directors are facing and were facing in July, there was still a lot of optimism related to this incentive program that the state has been funding for the past 2 years. Specifically, 75% of schools said, with the right support, we are confident that we will reach 30% spending of our lunch budget on New York grown food by 2025. And you can even see the breakdown here year upon year of when schools believe they will reach 30%. And we did some calculations and looked at the economic impact of that. And what we found was this would increase spending, school spending on food from New York farms to $250 million over the course of 5 years, while increasing access to healthy local food for more than 900,000 kids. That's more than half of the students across the state. And as we talked about building back better a bit before, overall we found that this could generate nearly $360 million in total economic impact. And that's using a conservative economic multiplier that Cornell prepared for New York State of 1.43, yielding a $3.50 return on investment to the state for every taxpayer dollar spent, all while improving health and supporting our farmers. And when people talk about building back better, this is exactly the kind of program I think about. And this is just assuming schools reach 30% and stop, which we just heard from Mikaela that many don't. And in addition, I'd like to mention that another unaccounted for benefit is that this builds our local supply chains, increasing the ability for other institutions like hospitals to buy New York grown food. But we won't get there without effort. And I'm going to hand the mic back over to Mikaela to share a little bit of information about the barriers that schools still face that we need to address in order to really unlock that full economic and public health opportunity for cute kids like this one and for our farmers.
I do love that picture. Thank you, Sam. So as we go through these barriers, I would ask you to keep in mind whether any of these resonate with you in the areas where you work on farm to school issues, because we will be asking a poll question at the end of this section to kind of gauge how things are for you with some of the issues that we cover. So we first asked schools about the barriers that they face to purchasing local food. And we found that cost remains the #1 issue still. In 2019, it was #1, and it stayed true this year. The availability and selection of New York grown food offered by vendors rose in importance from #3 to #2. And then rounding out our top 5 issues, we see that New York suppliers or suppliers of New York items are not least cost bidders, so schools cannot award contracts. We're also seeing budget limitations that schools are facing, and that is hampering their ability to buy New York grown food. And finally, rounding out, we are seeing that a lack of time to collect documentation to prove that these purchases are New York items is also a barrier. So then we asked food service directors taking our survey to rate all of the barriers that they identified in the context of how much of a challenge this posed to participating in the 30% initiative. And what we found is that cost fell tremendously, which is great because that means that this program is successfully defraying the impacts of cost. So it went from #1 all the way down to #9. It almost fell out of the top 10. We also saw that budget limitations fell in importance as well. We see that lack of time to collect documentation rose from #5 to #1. This was the highest rated barrier to participating in the program. There was also a lack of staff time to prepare New York grown food to serve. Again, as I mentioned before, there's a little bit more processing required sometimes with these ingredients. Again, we see the availability issue where current vendors either sell little or no New York grown food. Suppliers of New York grown food are not least cost bidders. Again, we saw this in the top 5 issues of purchasing New York grown food, and it's also a barrier to program participation. We did see that some schools were not sure where to start purchasing from New York farms, but just kind of embarking on this endeavor, which is why farm to school coordinators are hugely important. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then finally, rounding out our top 10, we see that also producers of New York items aren't bidding on with schools. There aren't enough shelf-stable local products in the winter months. And finally, vendors can't provide documentation to affirm sourcing. So overall, we're seeing definitely some capacity issues and problems with documentation. These two barriers that have been marked with an asterisk, number 3 and number 9, were also identified by New York City public schools when we surveyed them separately. They also said that New York grown food often did not meet their specifications, quality standards, or food safety certification requirements, and that the school payment system was often incompatible with a lot of vendors of New York grown food. So then we asked another question about barriers that were specific to the program. And the top one that we saw was that a lot of schools felt the 30% threshold was too high for them to meet. We also saw that separating out lunch purchases from purchases made for other meals was definitely a significant challenge. And finally, we saw issues again with the documentation requirements, with schools saying that they were too strict. And again, the barriers marked with an asterisk were all affirmed by New York City public schools, especially separating lunch from other meals. Some schools did say that they believed they would never reach 30%, so we asked why. And actually, we didn't see too many things that were different from what other schools were identifying. The top 2 barriers were that cost of local food is too high, and vendors had a limited availability or selection of local products that schools either needed or wanted. Some of the other things that we saw and why schools thought they would never reach 30% was the availability of milk, and which is particularly an issue for some of our Long Island schools, but also schools across New York State. It was not limited to Long Island. We also saw that tracking was difficult. Suppliers were not demarcating items as being New York produced. The application system and the documentation requirements were too challenging. And then these were a bit unique for this group. We saw some schools say that their small size made it more challenging or not really worth their while to participate in this program. And also that their service style as a heat and serve school was a barrier as well. So now we would love to hear from you about whether these resonate with you in your area.
So if everybody could take a moment and consider the barriers just presented to you by Mikaela, so that we can get a sense as to whether in your area, for your school, in your service area, or as far as what you're hearing from constituents, whether these really resonate with you or there are others. I'm going to close that in just a moment. Looks like the numbers are still moving. All right, looks like they've stopped. And so here are our findings from this poll. Very unscientific poll. So 43% of attendees, all of you, say you share these barriers or your service area sees them too. 36%, some of them apply more than others, 18% weren't sure. But it seems like this resonates because only 2% said the barriers are different. And I know it's a question box, but if folks want to share, what are your barriers that are different in the question box, please go ahead. Of course, we're also going to invite you all to stay in touch with us by email as well, so you can continue to share that kind of information. So in what Mikaela just presented, we heard a lot about vendors not having selection. We heard about supply chain issues, and we heard about capacity issues. But over and over, we heard that schools, that supply just isn't there, that the New York items are at least cost, that New York producers aren't bidding, that their vendors don't have supply of New York products. And so we thought it really important to look into this question about procurement. Now, for those of you who aren't steeped in this in the day-to-day, procurement laws or regulations are those rules that schools need to follow to buy anything, but including food. And our procurement laws that schools need to follow are set at the state, federal, and local level. And schools are required to follow the most restrictive of the three. So the main thing that you need to understand about procurement laws that schools need to follow is that there is a threshold of purchasing above which, a financial threshold. Above that threshold, if schools are spending more than that, they need to go through a formal process. And beneath that, they go through an informal process. So first we'll talk about the formal process. So formal purchasing methods are required when schools are spending over that small purchase threshold that I mentioned, which is set in law. At the federal level, that threshold is $250,000. So that serves as the ceiling for what schools need to, when schools need to use formal methods. And it's also set at the state level at a more restrictive level than $250,000. And then it also can be set at the local municipal level as well. So when schools are procuring above that small purchase threshold, they follow the formal procurement method, and they're required to go through a fairly burdensome process. Requires administrative time. You need to put out a sealed RFP or an invitation for bids. You need to advertise it, and then you need to get 3 quotes from vendors. And whatever vendors meet your specifications the best, means they're the most responsive. And you're also required through this process to award your contract to the least cost bidder. And there are a couple of caveats to that, but generally this is the case. And so we asked schools, what kind of procurement methods do you use to buy New York grown food? And 46% of schools said they use formal methods to buy New York grown food. Now we think that this might be why schools continue to over and over again report the cost of New York food products as being their #1 barrier to buying local. If they are required to award a contract generally to the least cost bidder, if the New York vendor or farmer or bidder has a price that's just a bit higher than somebody from another state, then they're going to lose out generally on that contract when they're going through a formal process. So the other ways that they can procure are through informal methods. And one of those methods are small purchases. And again, that small purchase threshold. So once you're procuring amounts below the small purchase threshold, then you're allowed to use small purchase methods or informal methods. For this, schools call vendors directly. They don't have to do a sealed bid. They don't have to advertise publicly. They get 3 quotes, and then they award contract to the least cost, most responsive bidder to what they're looking for. Now, what's important to note is that the state of New York has its own small purchase threshold set forward in our general municipal law that is more restrictive than the federal threshold, and municipalities often do too. 23% of schools reported using small purchase methods to buy local. And then the third method that schools can use are for micro purchases. So these are for those small one-off purchases of $10,000 or less, and schools are allowed to make those kinds of purchases without much administrative legwork. They can call a farmer directly and say, I need $8,000 worth of carrots, or like 20 crates of carrots, how much is that going to cost? If it's below $10,000, they can just make that purchase if the farmer can supply. So I'm sure you can see how using small purchases or using micro purchase methods enable schools to more easily buy New York grown food. And 30% of schools reported making micro purchases to buy local. Given these numbers, we really think that these methods are underused and they represent untapped potential to increase spending on New York grown food for schools. Now, whether it's a matter of schools not knowing how to use these methods or whether it's the actual law itself, is a question that we did try to answer with this research that we did this summer. So the state small purchase threshold is set forth in General Municipal Law Section 103. And in this law, it basically puts forward that schools generally above a certain amount calculate their own small purchase threshold using a complicated formula based on the number of students and school days. And then if they're purchasing above a certain amount, they apply for waivers through state ed in certain cases. But basically, it's pretty confusing and administratively burdensome the way it's set forward in state law. And 68% of schools reported to us that they don't know what the state small purchase threshold actually is. That's confusing, and that's pretty tough when it comes to trying to figure out when you get to use these less restrictive informal methods. So we put forward that raising and simplifying the state small purchase threshold in our general municipal law could enable schools to increase the amount they spend locally and help them reach 30%. And I'm going to hand it over to Mikaela to start us off in talking about breakfast. Many of you may remember when we talked about barriers, that separating lunch was a big barrier. There were some conversations that happened last year about how breakfast should be included and whether. So this was one of the biggest impetuses for our research. Mikaela.
Yeah, so for those of you not in New York, get ready for a little bit of a dive into the weeds, but hopefully this will give you some insights if you're thinking about how to incorporate breakfast into your own program for those of you coming from outside of New York. So this question of whether and how to include breakfast was, as Samantha mentioned, one of the motivating questions behind this research, in addition to the other topics we've covered. Next slide. So why? Why add breakfast? It is one of the most significant meals that is offered at school in addition to lunch. According to our research, 97% of total meal costs are shared between breakfast and lunch, and 95% of schools are serving breakfast, compared to only 60% serving other meals like snack, weekend meals, supper, holiday, and things like that. Also, as we've seen from the barriers, separating breakfast purchases from lunch purchases is administratively challenging, especially because of the number of purchases of New York produced milk, which is served at both meals. We also feel that focusing this program solely on lunch limits the economic potential and student health impact of this program. From what we've seen so far, Farm to School is a fantastic mechanism for investing in public health and child nutrition, and also helping our farmers. So we would love to see its potential expanded. And finally, there's concern that schools are incentivized to shift their purchases of New York foods that they are buying for other meals like breakfast or snack and moving them to lunch in order to qualify for the program, thereby creating a mirage of increase in farm spending while actually decreasing access for students to these foods throughout the school day. So, taking a closer look, we collected some financial data from the schools that we surveyed about their purchases of New York grown food and when they served them. We found that 83% of schools reported serving New York grown foods at breakfast. The schools that are serving those products are spending roughly 28% of total food costs on breakfast on average, and 23% of that is spent on breakfast, New York grown food products served at breakfast. Finally, nearly half of that 23% is due to purchases of New York produced milk. So these are some of the products that schools are serving at breakfast. As you may have guessed, milk is a huge one, with 84% of schools reporting that they serve New York produced fluid milk at breakfast. We also see a lot of apples, and also products like yogurt, grape juice, eggs, cheese sticks, granola, and a few meat products as well, with sausage and bacon, and also potatoes, not a meat product. So just thinking back to our earlier slide about some of the products served at lunch, I just want to point out kind of some of these more processed items like yogurt, and grape juice and granola, which is another reason to kind of take a close look at breakfast. Because of the types of items that are served, this is another way to really drive a lot of investment in the local food economy. So in a second, Samantha is going to walk us through different breakfast scenarios that we examined in our research. But to help us with this process, it is helpful to have some numbers to keep in mind. So this right here is a hypothetical school A in southern tier of New York, or wherever you care to place it. Hypothetical school A has total food costs for all of their meals at $100,000. They spend $69,000 on lunch, and this is based off of what we found from our research. 69% of total food costs go towards lunch. They're spending $15,000 on New York food products that they're serving at lunch. They're spending $28,000 on breakfast. This is also based off of our research, as you saw from the earlier slide. 28% of total food costs are spent on breakfast. And let's say they're spending $7,000 on New York food products served at breakfast. So if school A successfully qualifies for the 30% initiative, they would receive $21,000 in reimbursement. And that is an arbitrary number that we picked to help us make this example work. So under the current program, the threshold that school A would have to meet in order to qualify for the program would be $20,700, which is 30% of their lunch food costs. Currently, they have $15,000 in spending that would qualify. This is the money that they're spending on New York food products served at lunch. The amount that they need to increase their spending on New York food products in order to qualify is $5,700. So under the current program, as it is right now, school A has to spend $5,700 more on New York food products to reach that threshold of $20,700, and they would receive a $21,000 reimbursement from the state.
Thank you, Mikaela. So I'm going to pick it up from here and introduce one scenario that we explored. So the first scenario of adding breakfast, of how we may add breakfast in New York, would be to keep the threshold the same at 30% of lunch costs and allow schools to count breakfast purchases they're currently making to achieve 30%. So our data shows that this would help schools. 39% of schools said this would help them successfully qualify for the incentive. 82% reported that they would qualify by 2025, which is 7% more than our 75% that said they would do so with only lunch. And on average, schools reported that it would take them about 1 year less than what it currently takes them to reach 30% if breakfast were included in this way. But this wouldn't really help New York's farm economy as much. We collected financial data from schools and we got 72 usable responses. So some of this information is based off of those responses. 16% of schools who do not currently qualify would qualify automatically for this program without increasing their spending on farm products. 58%, or almost 2/3 of that automatic eligibility, would be due to their milk purchases alone. And this alone could cost the state almost $9 million in reimbursements to those schools that are automatically qualifying without increasing their spending. And that's, for those of you who work in state government or are familiar with our state budget, that's just about the whole budgetary allocation that's in the education budget for this program. So let's look at school A again. Under this scenario, the threshold that school A would need to meet to qualify would remain the same, $20,700. The total spending that they're currently engaging in that qualifies would be $22,000, and that's their lunch spending, which was $15,000, plus their breakfast spending, which was $7,000. Therefore, the increase in the amount they would need to spend to qualify for the incentive would be $0, so they'd be adding no more to the farm economy, and they would receive $21,000 in reimbursement from the state because they would already qualify. So let's look at a different scenario. We decided to explore a different way of adding breakfast to this program. What if we were to change the threshold to 30% of lunch and breakfast and allow schools to count the breakfast and lunch purchases they're making to qualify? So what we found, big picture, was that deploying this scenario, so including breakfast in this way, would ease the program's administrative burden for schools, so they would no longer have to separate breakfast and lunch. They'd be getting that benefit. It would retain the incentive to increase spending on food from New York farmers. And from those 72 responses I mentioned before, only 3% of schools would automatically qualify for the program if it was done like this. And you would retain student access to healthy local food throughout the school day, which is really quite important. But this would shortchange our schools, and that 19 cents that they would get would not cover the higher spending costs many of them would need to make to qualify for breakfast. This would also make the program unachievable for those who can't buy New York produced milk. And 3% of the schools who currently qualify for the program or would have to increase their spending to re-qualify. So let's look back at school A. How would they fare under this scenario? The threshold they would need to meet to qualify would be $29,100. That's 30% of lunch and breakfast food costs. The total spending that they're making to qualify would be $22,000. And so they'd need to then increase their spending by $7,100, which was more than that $5,700 from before, in order to receive $21,000 from the state, not covering the full amount that they're spending, $29,100. So, knowing all of what we just presented about program in year 1, program in year 2, the barriers, the breakfast issue, the procurement laws, we have some recommendations for the state and for others to consider as they're considering an incentive program for their own state. Because those schools that are already making 30%, those 57 schools, those are our early adopters, those that are really passionate about helping cute kids like this have greater access to New York produced products. But we want to motivate all schools to spend more and reach 30%. Without implementing these recommendations, this program may stagnate and we won't reach that full potential of the economic and public health opportunity that it presents us to build back better. So I'll also mention, actually, before I get to recommendations, that after collecting all of this data, we also put our heads together with our partners, members of the New York Grown Food for New York Kids Coalition, to develop all these recommendations for the state. And this coalition, for those of you that are not familiar with us, is comprised of school, farm, food, anti-hunger, environmental, economic development, and many other organizations advocating for farm to school and working on farm to school in New York. So you may be wondering, after all of that about breakfast, what is our recommendation? We recommend adding an incentive for breakfast to the current program. This would keep the program growing without shortchanging our farms or our schools or our kids. And in fact, we found that this would really grow the economic impact of this incentive program. If 75% of schools were to reach 30% of spending of their breakfast costs on New York food, this would mean over $78 million annually in spending from schools on at New York farms or on New York food products. And this would generate $112 million in total yearly statewide economic activity just for school breakfast. And best of all, more students would have access to healthy local food throughout the entire school day. And this would mean between breakfast and lunch, this program could generate $500 million in economic impact statewide. But we recognize, and I'll get a little bit more into the weeds here for New York, our coalition recognizes that the state is in a really tough budget spot this year. So our recommendation is to maintain funding for the current program, keep it for lunch, and to work to design a breakfast incentive for inclusion in future years. This is going to be critically important to make sure the program grows. So next, here are barriers from earlier to program participation. These are what are keeping schools from feeling motivated to hit 30%. In blue, you see highlighted those barriers that can be overcome by greater external support. And what is our greatest form of external support right now is our Farm to School Grants program, funded through the state budget in the agriculture and education areas. This program helps schools invest in hiring farm to school coordinators, purchasing equipment, or training their staff. Critically important to address those barriers and unlock this program's potential. Also really important to ensure these investments are reaching urban schools as they have been, but to ensure they continue to. Furthermore, however, to really unlock this program, we need to invest in farm to school coordinators. And this is something that we could do through the Farm to School Grants program by investing in putting a regional farm to school coordinator in every area of New York State. And just to give a quick example, in the southern tier, there is a BOCES that is working tirelessly on farm to school, a real champion now. But they said before they were able to hire a farm to school coordinator, they were able to serve maybe New York carrot sticks or New York apples here and there. Now they've got New York items throughout their menu. They're making things like stews from New York items, they're purchasing New York yogurt and carrot and cheese sticks and grape juice, and they're a real leader in farm to school in New York. So that coordinator really unlocked that potential for them. Buffalo has a coordinator as well, and they've hit the 30% for the past couple of years. So we recommend this year continuing to invest in the Farm to School Grants program at the same level, $1.5 million, and then sectioning off part of that, dedicating $500,000 from that program to fund a Farm to School Regional Coordinator program, putting a regional coordinator in every area of New York State. So then in purple here, you'll see the barriers highlighted that are related to procurement. And so we really recommend that the state raise and simplify that state small purchase threshold, and that local governments raise small purchase thresholds to help schools use those informal methods to buy New York grown food. And then also that we continue to provide training to schools on how to use procurement methods, different procurement methods available to them, like geographic preference and micro purchases to buy local. So for this, the ask is pretty simple for the state to simplify and increase the state small purchase threshold in GML 103 to 250,000 or something closer to the federal threshold. And then here you see some of the barriers highlighted really related to the supply chain. And so we really recommend that the state look at investments in the farm to school supply chain to improve access to local food and support schools also in procuring New York produced milk. And I'm pleased to say that thanks to Senator Metzger and Assemblywoman Lupardo's leadership, that there is a bill that was just signed, thank you Governor Cuomo, to create a supply chain working group to really identify those gaps in our local supply chains and to strengthen them. That's really exciting work, and we're very, very pleased that the state took that step. And then finally, these two barriers here, number 1 and number 10, are related to documentation and tracking. And so we recommend that the agencies streamline program administrative requirements to help schools, lower that barrier for schools who just don't have the admin time to collect, and to help our farm to school coordinators to really know what to prepare and help schools in preparing. And then also really critically, we didn't go over this in this report because it was covered so densely in the last report, Growing Opportunity for Farm to School, which you can find on our website. But we really need to continue to ensure that the paperwork required of schools by our agencies to prove they hit 30% really reliably shows and proves that purchases come from New York farms. One way to do that is with spot checks. Another is with technology, things like blockchain. So these are other, we highly recommend introducing spot checks. But these are other strategies to make sure that this program really does impact our farmers and increase access to healthy local food for our kids. And then I'm going to hand it back to Mikaela to sum this all up before we take some questions. So put all your questions in there now.
Yeah. So the biggest, you can go to the next slide, takeaway, actually further research, that comes first. So we already kind of mentioned a couple of things that are on our minds that we want to look into when we next have the opportunity to do so. First and foremost is getting a better understanding of the potential inequities in access to local foods, particularly in urban areas, but also across the state, which ties into our need to look into what is keeping schools from being able to buy New York milk. These kind of issues of access, we want to make sure that all students across New York are able to benefit from this program, and also all of New York's farmers. So these are two areas that we need to look into to better understand some of the gaps that currently exist. Also, as we discussed, we think that this program would really benefit from the inclusion of breakfast. So more work needs to be done to figure out what exactly that program would look like and how we could incentivize spending on New York foods served at breakfast. And finally, both last year's research and this year's research both really focus on the school side of farm to school purchasing. But we also need to cover the farm side. We need to understand what are some of the barriers that farmers face in selling to K-12 schools and other institutions to participate in this linkage. So what have we learned from all of this? Above all, from what we have seen in the first 2 years of this program, it works. It is doing what it is supposed to do. It is defraying the impact of cost and helping schools to buy more products from New York farmers. Schools are serving more fresh fruits and vegetables and milk to students. This program is helping to support child nutrition and public health, while also helping to drive investment in local supply chains and markets. Again, think of the growth in lightly processed products and things like cheese sticks and granola and grape juice. This is really exciting. These are new companies and new products and new money and excitement and energy that is happening in our local supply chains. And as Samantha mentioned, not only does this investment make it easier for other schools to join in and increase their purchases of local products, it makes it easier for everyone else too. Hospital systems, universities, other institutional buyers. This program is driving investment from schools, but everyone benefits. So we have shown you many potential estimates of the economic impacts of this program for New York's farmers and our statewide economy. I want to emphasize that these numbers are conservative. This is our best guess with the information that we have, but as you've seen, schools are not stopping at 30%. They're going above and beyond, which is fantastic. And it means that the impact is substantial. And again, that $5 million in spending on New York food products by those 57 schools that qualified that applied after program year 2, those are the schools that we know about that said they reached 30% and they want to qualify for the program. But there's everyone else. There's that 69% of schools that say that they're working towards the program. They're increasing their purchases, is in their sights. So now more than ever, we need smart policies like this one that support multiple state goals simultaneously. This program is a hugely exciting win-win for New York State that helps us invest in our public health, support our farms, and invest in our food economy. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and listening. And we really look forward to answering your questions and having a great discussion about farm to school.
Thanks, Mikaela, and I will echo that. Thank you all so much for joining us, for your work, and for your attention. I am seeing a few questions pop up, and we've got 15 minutes, or we can certainly end early. But I'll start by answering the questions that are here. We've got a few, and if folks want to chime in and ask a few others, we're happy to answer whatever we get. So the first one I see here is about procurement. So we've got a question about geographic preference. And what about geographic preference in formal bids? Is that a tool being used in New York State? Appreciate this question. We did ask about geographic preference from our respondents. Only 2% said that they're using geographic preference to buy New York grown food. For those of you that aren't familiar with geopreference, it's basically a tool that can be used in formal bidding to allow schools to prefer food grown in a geographic area that they define in their bid. So the short answer is that schools are using it, but not many are. And that's part of why we think that making sure that there's really good training out there for schools on how they can bid out for New York products is really important, because we hear from vendors and distributors, well, we need the schools to ask us for it. And that is a piece of this. Part of it is building the supply chain, but then of course part of it is also making sure that schools have all the tools to follow state, local, and federal procurement laws successfully, but then really make sure that they are asking for what they need in a way that vendors can then meet them and give it to them. So hopefully that answers that question. And then there was another question about farm to school jobs from somebody who lives in Dutchess County who wants to get involved in farm to school. I'm not entirely sure where farm to school coordinator jobs would be advertised, but there are certainly ways to get involved in this work. Recommend visiting finesse.org to learn a little bit more, and just keep looking out for jobs that are available in farm to school. But there's an amazing network of folks across New York State doing this work who you could get tapped into. So I didn't put my email up on the screen, but in our follow-up, we will share a contact email if folks want to get involved and connected in with the network. And there's another question here about packaging. Packaging has been expensive for the yogurt parfaits with the granola. I'm assuming the New York granola. What can we do to see that we get inexpensive packaging? It's a great question, and one that I don't really have an answer to, but I thought that it was important to read out because there are a lot of smart people on this webinar and working on farm to school in New York. So certainly think that that's part of that supply chain building, that, what are the specific pieces, where are the gaps that we're missing? And packaging for schools and for kids in particular is definitely one of those nuts that processors need to crack to successfully sell into school markets. And then there is another question here. Buying locally grown due to a fruit and vegetable grant that hinders my spending. I don't want to give up when it is guaranteed money. So somebody mentioned that they've not qualified for the 30% even though they're buying locally grown due to a fruit and vegetable grant that hinders spending. Don't want to give them up when it is guaranteed money. I'm assuming that this may be about the commodity program, the fresh fruit and vegetable pilot program in New York State. That is a tough thing about this 30% program in New York. State Ed has determined, and the Department of Agriculture and Markets together in their guidance determined that commodity products or commodity dollars or commodities that schools get do not count towards the qualifying for the 30%. And so in last year's research, we did hear from schools that were really doing a sort of like just looking at what they were buying from commodity or what they were getting from commodity and looking at their budget and seeing what they can shift from commodity purchases or from commodities to purchases, actual purchases. Because the purpose of this program really is to increase the spending that schools are doing on New York food. So particularly for New York beef or other high value New York items, there were definitely schools that were really strategic about what they were buying. And there are a lot of resources available to schools that are looking to figure out how they can increase their spending and hit 30%. There's a database that Cornell keeps of New York food products, those processed products that qualify. And there are many service providers that can provide you with support and answer any questions. So once again, just get in touch with us and we can link you into the network if you're not linked in. That is it for questions that I see. Mikaela, is there anything that you want to add to any of the answers that I gave?
Nope, you hit it. Yeah, definitely wanted to highlight the work of Harvest New York, which is what Samantha was mentioning out of Cornell with the resources that they're assembling.
Yeah, there really is an incredible network of people across New York, farm to school coordinators really, who have been working to help schools hit 30% and troubleshoot how to do that and make sure that all the, state ed is working hard to make sure that schools know exactly what's expected of them to qualify for the program and when they're applying. So I know it might seem overwhelming, but there are people there. There are people to assist you and hold your hand and really help you think through this stuff. There could be more with the state farm to school regional coordinator program, but for now there are, and I'm happy to help you get connected into that network. So we'll send a follow-up email with information on how to contact us if you're not in touch with us already. But again, want to thank you all for joining this webinar. Thank you for your time and your attention. And look forward to continuing to connect with you in the coming months and years to answer any questions you have. So even if questions come up after this, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Yes, thank you everyone so much for joining us. I just want to reiterate that we really do want to hear from you about the issues that you're encountering and any insights that you would care to share with us or stories, because we're always on the lookout for more information about farm to school and what it looks like on the ground and how we can think about the problems that we're seeing in more creative ways.
And everybody, happy holidays. Hope you're all safe and well and that you stay well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.